rioters, communist agents, a rebellion crushed. That was the official story South Koreans in the world were told in May 1980 as armored trucks rolled through the city of Gwangju, machine guns rattled, and soldiers wreaked havoc on their own people. But behind the barricades and the blackout, another story was unfolding. One of steadfast students, factory workers, taxi drivers, parents, and children who rose up for 10 days to demand democracy. This is the story of the Gwangju Uprising. A battle not just between people in power, but between two competing stories. Between a government that used media to control and a few brave outsiders who used media to reveal the truth. To understand what happened in Gwangju and why, we have to go back about a year. In October 1979, South Korea's President Park Chung-hee was assassinated by Kim Jae-gu, the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. President Park had maintained control over South Korea for nearly 2 decades, initially seizing power in a 1961 military coup. His rule was marked by rapid industrialization and economic growth, but it came at the cost of brutal authoritarianism. Park had brazenly dissolved political opposition, curtailed press freedom, and passed the Yushin Constitution in 1972, which effectively gave him dictatorial powers for life. Over time, the public grew increasingly resentful of his repression, and even members of his own inner circle began to turn, leading us back to his ultimate assassination. Kim Jae-gu, who had once been a trusted ally, claimed he assassinated President Park to prevent further bloodshed and preserve South Korea's democracy. But the killing created a power vacuum at the top, and the country was thrown into immediate political chaos. Sensing an opportunity, General Chun Doo-hwan, then head of military intelligence, moved in swiftly. In a matter of days, he ordered the arrest of the Army's chief of staff, took control of the military chain of command, and began systematically eliminating his rivals. He ruled South Korea as a de facto military leader, effectively making the elected civilian president, Choi Koo-ha, a figurehead. Rather than rolling back Park's authoritarian rule, Chun intensified it. He launched an internal investigation under the Defense Security Command, supposedly to uncover subversive elements. In reality, it gave him an excuse to remove opposition figures and install loyalists throughout the government and military. What looked like a temporary consolidation of power was, in fact, a second coup. By May 1980, Chun had declared martial law across the entire country. He shut down universities, banned political gatherings, and suspended what little freedom of speech remained. Civilian life was militarized, protest was criminalized, and dissent was met with force. Chun had justified these sweeping actions by claiming that South Korea was under threat from both internal unrest and external communist influence. The narrative that he pushed wasn't new, but at the time had proven to be effective. This was the Cold War, after all, and communism carried weight. It stirred fear, shaped foreign policy, and allowed leaders to frame repression as protection. Chun's government claimed that the student protests erupting across the country weren't genuine calls for democracy, but coordinated attacks by North Korean agents. He warned that if left unchecked, the unrest could unravel the South and lead to collapse. Kim Dae-jung, the country's most well-known opposition figure, was arrested and accused of instigating the unrest. He was charged with sedition and conspiring with the North, despite a total lack of evidence. Internationally, Chun's story found sympathy. At best, the United States saw Chun as a necessary stabilizer. At worst, they accepted him as a brutal but useful ally in a Cold War chess game. In 1981, just months after the Gwangju Uprisings, newly elected President Ronald Reagan met with Chun Doo-hwan, praising him for preserving South Korea's, quote, freedom and democracy, despite knowing what had taken place just months before.
And General MacArthur spoke then of the special friendship that exists between our two countries and of our mutual commitment to democratic principles and individual liberty and personal dignity. In the very short time, Mr. President, that you've done much to strengthen the traditions of 5,000 years of Korean history. We share your commitment to freedom.
Behind the scenes, declassified CIA documents show that the U.S. was well aware of the violence in Gwangju, yet chose to prioritize regional stability over human rights. Inside South Korea, the media became the regime's most powerful tool. To many outside Gwangju, especially those disconnected from political activism, the protesters were seen not as heroes, but as troublemakers. The students were framed by national media to appear reckless, ungrateful, and disruptive to the fragile order the country had worked so hard to build. Worn down by decades of war and political turmoil, Many South Koreans accepted, or at least tolerated, Chun's narrative. Without access to real footage or testimony, it was easy to believe the military was simply doing what was necessary to restore order. For the nearly 1 million citizens within Gwangju's borders, the story looked nothing like what the rest of the country was being told. In the early morning hours of May 18th, paratroopers were deployed to the city under the justification of restoring order. But there was no violent uprising waiting for them, only students. Many had gathered outside Cheonam National University, frustrated by the school's forced closure and by the sweeping martial law that has suspended civil liberties across the country. They came with signs and chants, not weapons or threats. Like many protests, it began with noise and defiance, but it remained peaceful. That peace, however, didn't last long. The soldiers wouldn't issue warnings or hold their line. Instead, they moved in fast and they attacked. Students were clubbed with batons, dragged into trucks, kicked as they lay on the ground. Some were chased down side streets and beaten in front of shopkeepers and bystanders. To most people watching, it didn't seem like they were trying to control a crowd. It felt more like they were trying to punish one. Word spread quickly across the city, and as more citizens tried to check on loved ones or document what was happening, they too became targets. This wasn't just a crackdown. It was a display, a greater message. The regime had chosen Gwangju as the place to set an example. In the days after the first wave of violence, however, something began to shift. People in the city didn't run, they stepped in. Ordinary citizens, many with no political involvement at all, started helping however they could. Taxi drivers ferried the wounded to churches and makeshift clinics, even as bullets tore through the streets. Factory workers helped build barricades. Local families cooked meals, brought medicine, and opened their homes to strangers in need. Community leaders stepped up to maintain order. Volunteers cleaned the streets and delivered supplies. Hospitals were overwhelmed, but people made it work with what they had. The worst carnage came on May 27th. Just before dawn, the military returned. This time, however, there was zero restraint among them. Soldiers stormed buildings, opened fire on protesters, and crushed what was left of the resistance. The government claimed just over 200 people were killed, but survivors believe it was far more, possibly over 2,000. The uprising was over, and the city was finally quiet again. But this wasn't peace, it was silence, fear, and a story no one was allowed to speak of, at least for some time. Although Gwangju was sealed off from the rest of the country, word of what had happened there began to find its way out. Despite the government's efforts to control the narrative, rumors spread, and a small number of foreign journalists began investigating what South Korea's national media refused to report. One of the most determined among them was Jürgen Hinz-Peter, a German correspondent working for the West German broadcaster ARD. With the help of a local taxi driver named Kim Sa-bok, Hinz-Peter managed to reach Gwangju, slipping past military roadblocks and entering a city that had been turned into a war zone. What he saw challenged everything the government had claimed. Instead of communist agitators or violent mobs, he found wounded civilians lying untreated in hospitals, rows of coffins being prepared for mass funerals, and residents doing everything they could to help one another survive. Hinz-Peter filmed discreetly, knowing that exposure could endanger both himself and those helping him. Once he gathered enough footage, he managed to smuggle it out successfully. The material he recorded was broadcast across Europe and parts of the United States, offering the world a rare and unfiltered look at the brutal reality behind the military's actions in Gwangju. His story would later be adapted into the 2017 film A Taxi Driver, which helped bring renewed attention to the uprising, especially among younger generations who had grown up without a full understanding of what had happened during those 10 days in May. While the film focuses on Hinz-Peter's journey, it represents just one piece of a much larger effort by foreign journalists to uncover the truth. Reporters based in Japan, Germany, the United States, and other countries played a key role in collecting testimonies, sharing photographs, and amplifying the voices of survivors. Their coverage did not topple Chun Doo-hwan's regime, but it challenged the version of events that the South Korean government was trying to export. It created an alternative narrative, one that circulated internationally even while the domestic media remained silent. It took nearly a decade for South Korea to publicly reckon with Gwangju. Throughout the 1980s, open discussion remained dangerous, and many survivors were forced into silence. But as pro-democracy movements gained momentum, the demand for truth became harder to suppress. Over the next several years, the public understanding of Gwangju began to shift. By 1997, May 18th was declared a National Day of Remembrance. School textbooks were revised, memorials were built, and every year in the city where it happened, reenactments were performed to preserve the memory of those 10 days, this time in full view of the public. In 2023, Chun Doo-hwan, the grandson of Chun Doo-hwan, who passed away in 2021, was the first of his family to recognize and apologize for the atrocities that occurred in 1980 and the years that followed. The fight over Gwangju didn't end when the streets were cleared. It continued in the headlines, the broadcasts, and the history books, becoming a struggle over who would be believed, those who held power or those who lived through it. From the beginning, the South Korean government understood that controlling media meant controlling public perception. It wasn't just about soldiers in the streets. It was about framing the protesters as radicals, framing the crackdown as a defense of national stability. In this way, media became a tool not just to report events, but to shape them, to justify violence, to suppress outrage, and to erase what had happened before it could ever be understood. But over time, that same tool became the way the truth was reclaimed. Footage smuggled out of the city, reports from foreign journalists, and the voices of survivors who held onto their stories all worked together to reveal what the government had tried to hide. These accounts didn't just challenge the official narrative, they replaced it. Gwangju and the broader resistance it inspired are widely seen as the foundation of South Korea's modern democracy. Though the uprising was crushed, it ignited a movement that refused to be silenced, one that used truth, testimony, and media to challenge dictatorship and reclaim the narrative. In the years that followed, the memory of Gwangju became more than a tragedy. It became proof that even in the face of brutal repression, people will fight not only for their rights, but for the power to tell their story.